They would play at the
Where the hell did you get that necklace? The question wasn't whispered. It was launched across the Grand Bellagio ballroom like a grenade, halting every conversation, every motion, every breath. Forks froze midair. Champagne flutes trembled in the hands of Miami's most elite. And all eyes turned to the source of the fury. Eleanor Landon, matriarch of the Landon Empire. A woman raised on rules and reputation. Standing there in her satin gown and diamond earrings, she was less a socialite and more a loaded weapon. And her target, Chloe Reed. Chloe, black, poised, quiet, stood in crisp uniform near the edge of the room, her tray still balanced perfectly in one hand. She was the kind of woman most people in that room weren't trained to see. But now, she couldn't be ignored. I said. Eleanor repeated, louder now. Where the hell did you get that necklace, girl? Then it happened. In a blur of motion, Eleanor lunged. Her manicured hand snatched Chloe's blouse and ripped it open down the middle. The silk split with a hiss, buttons scattering across the marble floor. The room gasped. There, gleaming under the chandelier's light, was a platinum chain, antique, unmistakable. But below it, more shocking than the jewelry, was the scar stretched across Chloe's chest. Clean, deliberate. The kind you don't forget. The kind that tells a story. Chloe clutched her shirt instinctively, eyes wide, not from fear, but fury. She wasn't just exposed. She was violated. Then, a voice. Enough, mother. Alexander Landon, billionaire CEO, heir to the Landon fortune, was already across the ballroom. He shrugged off his blazer, wrapping it gently around Chloe before turning to face his mother. She's not just a waitress, he said, voice low but sharp. She's the woman who saved my life. Silence. In a room built on power, one black woman's story had just shattered the script. This isn't just drama. It's history unfolding. This is a black story that demands to be heard. So don't scroll. Don't skip. Stay right here. Because the truth? It's just getting started. 2 years before the chaos at the Grand Bellagio ballroom, Chloe Reed was just a nursing student with 3 jobs and not enough hours in the day. She lived in a small apartment above a laundromat in Savannah, Georgia. The kind of place where the hot water worked when it felt like it and the walls were thin enough to hear your neighbors breathe. She didn't complain. She was used to fighting quietly. It was late September when the accident happened. She had just finished a long shift at the diner off Route 46. Her feet ached. Her hair was pulled back with the same scrunchie she had used 3 days in a row. She was crossing the street to catch the late bus when she heard the crash. The sound wasn't small. It was the kind of impact that makes the world pause. Tires screeching, metal twisting, then silence, until the wind picks up and people start to scream. Chloe didn't hesitate. By the time she reached the mangled motorcycle, the rider was already unconscious. His helmet was cracked. His chest barely moved. Blood soaked the asphalt beneath him. She dropped to her knees, checked his pulse, and began compressions. She didn't know who he was. Not yet. She just knew she couldn't let him die. With one hand holding his head steady and the other pressing rhythm into his ribs, Chloe shouted for help. A few bystanders called 911, but none dared to get close. She kept going. Her palms burned. Her knees bled through ripped jeans. But her voice never cracked. By the time EMTs arrived, the man's heart was still beating. When they loaded him into the ambulance, she finally exhaled. And just as quickly, she disappeared. No name. No number. She didn't stay for credit. She never had time for recognition. Later that week, she found the necklace. Not in her pocket, not by chance, but on the ground where the crash had happened. Platinum. Engraved with initials she didn't recognize then. A simple piece. But it felt like a weight. A thread tying her to something bigger. She kept it. Not as a trophy. As a reminder. Because in that moment, under the Savannah sky, covered in blood and gravel, Chloe had chosen to save a stranger's life. That stranger was Alexander Landon. And neither of them knew that night would follow them all the way to Miami. Chloe Reed never planned to step foot into the Grand Bellagio ballroom. Not as a guest, and certainly not as a centerpiece of scandal. The job came through a temp agency. One night only. Black dress code. Formal service. Triple pay. She hesitated for a second. She was tired, her clinical hours were brutal, but tuition didn't wait for rest, and rent was always due. So she showed up. Hair in a neat bun. White blouse pressed. Name tag sharp. Another night on her feet, pouring drinks for people who wouldn't remember her name. It wasn't until the third hour of the gala that she saw him. She didn't know his name, not really. She had only seen his face once, unconscious and bloodied, back on that Georgia pavement. But now, here he was, clean-cut, in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her entire semester, glass of bourbon in hand, surrounded by the kind of people who used legacy like a last name. Alexander Landon. Chloe recognized him instantly. But she didn't react. Years of working service jobs had taught her how to disappear in plain sight. She moved toward his table to refill water glasses. Her hands were steady. Her eyes low. Then it happened. He looked up. Just a glance at first, polite and distant. Then his eyes flicked down, to the necklace resting gently against her collarbone. Platinum. Subtle. Familiar. He froze. The water pitcher in Chloe's hand trembled ever so slightly. She felt his stare like heat against her skin. She knew. He knew. Alexander's jaw clenched, and for a moment, he looked as if he had seen a ghost. He pushed back his chair, about to stand, when his mother's voice shattered the moment. "Where the hell did you get that necklace?" It was loud. Angry. Meant to draw blood. And before Chloe could say a single word, her blouse was ripped open, her scar exposed, her past laid bare. But what Eleanor Landon hadn't expected, what no one in that room had expected, was that the woman she just tried to humiliate was the very woman who had saved her son's life. And that life was about to stand up for her, for the whole world to see. The ballroom was frozen. No one moved. No one dared breathe. Eleanor Landon stood tall, her hands still clutching the torn fabric, as if she had done something righteous. Chloe stood in stunned silence, her chest exposed, her scar catching the soft light like a painful memory. The necklace rested just below it, still and gleaming, the only thing in the room that seemed untouched by shame. And then, he moved. Alexander Landon stood so fast his chair screeched back across the marble. His face was pale, but his eyes blazed with something far more dangerous than shock. Fury. He crossed the distance in long, sure strides. He didn't speak at first. He didn't need to. The silence around him was the kind that came before storms. He took off his tailored blazer, black and custom fit, and wrapped it gently around Chloe's shoulders. Not out of pity, but protection. Respect. Then he turned to face his mother. "You've crossed a line," he said, voice low but cutting. Eleanor blinked. "Alex, No," he snapped. Don't even try." The room gasped softly, a collective reaction to seeing power shift in real time. "She's not just a waitress," Alexander said louder now, voice rising with every word. "She's the woman who saved my life. 2 years ago, on a back road in Georgia, I crashed my bike and almost bled out on the pavement. She kept me alive with her bare hands. While strangers stood around filming on their phones, she acted. She didn't ask for anything. She vanished before I could even say thank you." He looked around the room. "And tonight, while all of you sip champagne and gossip about scandals that don't belong to you, this woman stood here doing her job, and you," he turned back to Eleanor, "you humiliated her in front of everyone." Eleanor's face was tight with disbelief, but she didn't interrupt. Alexander's voice dropped lower. "Do you know what kind of strength it takes to stay silent after being treated like this? Do you know how much dignity it takes to hold your head up when someone tries to rip you apart?" He turned to Chloe, eyes softening. You deserved better. From all of us. Then, back to the room. I won't let this go. Not tonight. Not ever. And with that, Alexander Landon, CEO of a billion-dollar empire, took Chloe Reed's hand in his and walked her out of the ballroom, leaving behind gasps, judgment, and the mother who no longer held control. By sunrise, the story was everywhere. It started as a video on someone's phone, shaky, poorly framed, but crystal clear where it mattered. Eleanor Landon's voice. The sound of fabric tearing. Chloe's scar. Alexander's fury. And those 6 unforgettable words. She's the woman who saved my life. Within hours, it was on TikTok, Twitter, and morning news segments from coast to coast. The hashtags exploded. Hashtag Landon Scandal. Hashtag Chloe Reed. Hashtag She Saved Him. Hashtag Black Story That Matters. The footage had gone viral before Chloe even made it back to her apartment. She sat on the edge of her twin bed, Alexander's blazer still draped over her shoulders, scrolling in disbelief as her own face filled her screen. Some called her brave. Others called her a symbol. Many called her the dignity this country rarely gets to see. Comment sections were flooded. I would have cried on the spot. The way she held it together? Power. This is exactly what Black women deal with every day. Silenced, disrespected, and still standing. Eleanor Landon should be ashamed. Chloe deserves the world. But not every reaction was kind. There were skeptics. The usual crowd who twisted compassion into accusation. She set him up. She knew who he was. This feels too perfect. Almost like a PR stunt. Why was she even wearing that necklace? Yet for every cynic, there were 1,000 voices defending her. Meanwhile, the media went into overdrive. News anchors ran side-by-side footage, Chloe giving compressions at the accident scene from old traffic camera footage, and then Chloe in the ballroom, face calm despite being torn open. Photos of Alexander bleeding on Georgia pavement juxtaposed with him walking out of the gala, holding Chloe's hand like it was his own compass. By noon, talk shows were debating it. PR analysts speculated on damage control. Political commentators argued about race, class, and legacy. And across the country, millions watched a narrative shift in real time. Alexander responded the only way he knew how. Directly. He scheduled a press conference that evening. No lawyers. No script. Standing at a podium outside Landon Industries, he looked into a sea of flashing lights and said simply, "Her name is Chloe Reed. She saved my life. Last night, she was humiliated by people who should have known better. From this moment forward, I will use every part of my platform to make that right." And just like that, Chloe's story stopped being whispered. It became history. While the world was talking, Eleanor Landon was quiet. The mansion on Coral Ridge felt colder than usual, the kind of silence that hums like warning. She hadn't left the house since the gala. No public statement. No apology. Just a single comment whispered to the butler, "Bring me her file." But Eleanor Landon wasn't built to sit still. She had spent her life commanding rooms with her smile and crushing reputations with a raised brow. And now, a waitress, no, a nurse, had unraveled her in front of everyone that mattered. She wasn't done yet. The next day, Chloe got a message. A private car would be waiting outside her apartment at noon. No signature. No explanation. Just black ink on white paper. A conversation. Nothing more. She hesitated. Then, she went. The car pulled up in front of the Landon estate. Iron gates opened slowly, like jaws. A butler led her through the long hallways until she reached a sunroom that felt more like a throne room than a lounge. Eleanor sat in the center, poised and dressed in soft beige. Calm, elegant, dangerous. "Miss Reed," she said, voice like velvet over steel. "Thank you for coming." Chloe didn't sit. "I didn't come for tea." Eleanor smiled, tight and cold. "No, I suppose not. So let's speak plainly." She folded her hands in her lap. Whatever happened that night, whatever narrative the public has chosen to believe, it's getting out of control. My son is blinded. His reputation is unraveling. And you, well, you're at the center of it. Chloe said nothing. Eleanor leaned forward slightly. I am prepared to offer you something. A very generous exit. A scholarship to finish school. A stipend to relocate. No cameras. No noise. You disappear. Quietly. Chloe looked her dead in the eye. You want to buy my silence. Eleanor didn't flinch. I want to protect my son. Chloe's voice was steady. I already did that. On a road in Georgia. When I didn't know his name. When I didn't need anything in return. Eleanor's fingers tightened. You've made your point. But this game you're playing. Chloe stepped forward. This isn't a game. I didn't ask for this spotlight. But I won't run from it either. I didn't bow then. And I won't bow now. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. Then you've made your choice. Chloe nodded. No. You made it. The night you tore my uniform. She turned, walked out of the room, and left behind the only thing Eleanor had ever feared. A woman with nothing left to lose, and nothing left to hide. The days that followed moved slowly. After the firestorm of headlines and the tension of Eleanor's quiet threat, the world outside seemed to settle, but only on the surface. Beneath it, everything had changed. And at the center of that change was a man and a woman whose lives were never meant to intertwine. But they had. Chloe stayed off social media. She ignored reporters. She kept her head down, attending her nursing classes during the day and resting in silence at night. But one afternoon, as she left the university library, a familiar car pulled up to the curb. Alexander stepped out. No cameras. No press. Just him in jeans and a soft navy sweater, holding 2 cups of coffee and looking more like a man than a CEO. I figured you might need caffeine, he said, offering her one. She hesitated, then took it. They walked along the path by the water, where the breeze carried the scent of salt and something calmer. For a while, they said nothing. Just sipped coffee, shoes crunching lightly on the gravel. Then he spoke. Do you remember anything I said that night at the gala? Chloe glanced sideways. All of it. He nodded. Good. Because I meant every word. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stopped by the edge of the walkway and looked out across the bay. I didn't save you for applause, she said softly. I didn't even know who you were. I saw someone bleeding, and I acted. That's all. Alexander stepped beside her. But that's not all. That's courage. That's instinct. That's who you are. She looked at him now, her voice lower. You're not used to people doing things without an angle, are you? He smiled, a little sad. Not anymore. They sat on a bench near the water, letting the late sun fall over them. He asked about her classes, about her goals, about how she ended up in that ballroom that night. She told him everything. Well, almost everything. She left out the parts about growing up with a father who lost everything trying to do the right thing. But Alexander saw it anyway. He saw the weight she carried. The strength behind her silence. And somewhere between her laugh and her scars, admiration shifted into something deeper. When they stood to leave, he reached for her hand. Not forceful, not rushed. Just steady. Chloe didn't pull away. She didn't say a word. But in that moment, a bond formed. Not because of what they survived, but because of how they saw each other now. Clearly, finally, and without armor. It started with a conversation over dinner. They were seated at a quiet table in a small Cuban restaurant tucked into a side street of Coconut Grove. No paparazzi. No media frenzy. Just warm lighting, soft music, and 2 people trying to figure out what came next. Chloe picked at her food slowly, her appetite shadowed by something heavier. My father used to work for Landon Pharmaceuticals, she said, voice low. Alexander looked up. Really? She nodded. Years ago. Back when your grandfather still ran it. He leaned in slightly. What happened? Chloe paused, her fingers tracing the rim of her water glass. He was in logistics. Nothing flashy. But one day, he flagged a shipment. Said something felt off with the paperwork. Discrepancies. Missing quantities. He reported it. Alexander frowned. And they fired him within a week. Blacklisted him. Said he breached protocol. After that, no one would hire him in the industry again. Her words weren't angry. They were steady. Worn smooth by time. Alexander sat back in his chair, his jaw tightening. Do you remember the name of the shipment? Or the department? Chloe pulled a small piece of folded paper from her wallet. Faded ink. A name. A date. Just in case, she said. That night, after walking her home, Alexander couldn't sleep. He stayed up in his home office, poring through old files, archived documents, and internal memos. He made calls. Pulled favors. It didn't take long. The records confirmed it. Her father had indeed raised a red flag on a fraudulent shipment connected to a mid-level executive skimming profits. But instead of rewarding him for his honesty, the company buried the scandal. The executive was quietly transferred. Chloe's father was made the fall guy. And at the top of the cover-up, Eleanor Landon. She had authorized the internal correction to avoid bad press, noting in a memo that no-name employee disruption was not worth jeopardizing a legacy contract. Alexander read the line 3 times. No-name employee. He stared at the page, disgust building in his chest. Chloe's father hadn't just lost his job. He had lost his dignity, so the Landon name could remain polished in public. Alexander leaned back in his chair, hands in his hair, guilt twisting in his stomach. This wasn't about one night in a ballroom anymore. It was about decades of silence. And the woman he loved had carried the weight of it without ever knowing where the wound began. Until now. The next morning, Alexander didn't show up to the office. He showed up at his mother's estate. No assistants. No press. Just him and a folder full of papers. Eleanor was seated on the veranda, a crystal glass of orange juice beside her and a book she wasn't really reading. She looked up when she saw him and offered a soft smile. Controlled, elegant, untouched by consequence. Alexander, she said. I wasn't expecting you. He sat across from her without speaking. She tilted her head. Is this about the foundation gala? I think we've all had time to reflect. He dropped the folder onto the table. It landed with a soft thud, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. Open it. Eleanor's smile didn't move, but her fingers hesitated. She opened the folder. Inside were scanned memos, emails, shipping records, and the original complaint filed by Chloe's father nearly 20 years ago. Alexander's voice was cold. He raised concerns about a shipment of mislabeled medications. And you had him fired. Blacklisted. His name wiped from every system. Eleanor looked at the pages without reacting. That was a long time ago. Not long enough for it to stop hurting him. Or his daughter. Her eyes finally met his. I protected this family, she said. I did what I had to do. No, Alexander said, standing now. You protected yourself. Your name. Your deals. You sacrificed a good man to avoid embarrassment. She stood too, her voice rising. I built this legacy. Everything you have, your company, your name, it exists because I never let anything threaten it. But it is threatened, Alexander snapped. Not by Chloe. By you. By what you covered up. By the silence you forced. You humiliated a woman who saved me, and now I find out you destroyed her father's life. Eleanor's voice softened, but the edge remained. She doesn't belong in our world. Alexander stepped closer. She belongs in mine. The silence between them stretched, sharp and final. I'm done protecting lies, he said. And if legacy means covering up injustice, I want no part of it. He turned and walked away, leaving the folder on the table. Every page of it, a mirror reflecting the kind of truth Eleanor had spent her life pretending didn't exist. She didn't follow him. Because for the first time, Eleanor Landon understood what it felt like to lose control. And worse, she knew she had earned it. 2 days later, Alexander called a press conference. It wasn't held in the usual glass-walled boardroom at Landon Industries. It wasn't behind a podium with company banners or with a teleprompter feeding him lines. It was outside, on the steps of the Miami Civic Center, in front of a crowd that didn't know what to expect. Reporters buzzed like flies around microphones. Cameras rolled from every direction. Chloe stood off to the side, watching quietly, her hands clasped in front of her, heart pounding. She hadn't wanted to be here. But Alexander asked. And something in his voice, steady, calm, final, told her this wasn't about damage control. This was about truth. Alexander stepped up to the mic, sleeves rolled, no script in sight. His voice was low but clear. For the past few weeks, a lot has been said about legacy, image, and reputation. But very little has been said about accountability. He paused, scanning the crowd. My mother's actions at the Bellagio Gala were inexcusable. And while I've spent my entire life defending the Landon name, I will not defend silence or cruelty. The crowd shifted. Eyes widened. Pens moved faster. I've reviewed internal records from our company's past, he continued. And what I found was unacceptable. 20 years ago, my mother allowed the career and livelihood of an honest man, Malcolm Reed, to be destroyed for speaking the truth. That man is the father of Chloe Reed, the woman who saved my life. That is no coincidence. That is karma catching up. Murmurs swept through the crowd. Chloe's chest tightened. Effective immediately, Alexander said, my mother will no longer serve on the board of Landon Industries or its philanthropic foundation. A few audible gasps. I am also establishing a full scholarship program in Malcolm Reed's name for students pursuing careers in public health and ethics. And Chloe Reed, who has asked for none of this attention, has accepted a position as the Director of Community Wellness at the Landon Foundation. Not because of me, but because of who she already is. He glanced over at her. Chloe didn't smile. But she didn't look away either. Sometimes, Alexander said, the only way to honor a legacy is to rewrite it. With that, he stepped down, the microphones buzzing behind him. He walked straight to Chloe and held out his hand, not as a CEO reaching for an employee, but as a man owning his truth. And this time, the world watched in silence. Not to judge, but to witness. Months passed. The headlines faded, the hashtags slowed, and life, strangely, found a rhythm again. Chloe graduated with honors from nursing school. She moved into a modest apartment in Coral Gables, closer to the Landon Foundation offices. Her days were spent building outreach programs, leading community health initiatives, and finally, doing the work she had dreamed of without having to fight for a seat at the table. She and Alexander didn't rush anything. There were no grand declarations, no magazine covers, no performative date nights for the cameras. Just dinners on the rooftop of his downtown condo. Walks by the bay when the city quieted down. Moments where words weren't needed because they already understood too much about pain, about pressure, about being seen and unseen at the same time. He gave her space. She gave him honesty. And somewhere in the middle of all that gentleness, something real grew. One spring afternoon, on the lawn of the Foundation's annual fundraiser, Chloe stood in a simple blue dress, smiling as a group of kids presented a mural they had painted. Images of strength, healing, and people who looked like them doing work that mattered. Alexander stepped onto the stage to thank them. His speech was short. Then, he turned toward her, still holding the microphone. Chloe, he said, you saved my life once. You gave me reason. You gave me courage. And every day since, you've taught me how to live it better. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring. No cameras, no crowd pressure, just a simple box in his hand and something honest in his eyes. I don't want to spend another season wondering if the world will understand us. I only care that we understand each other. Will you marry me? The crowd held its breath. Chloe didn't cry. She stepped forward, took his hand, and whispered into the mic without hesitation. Yes. The applause that followed wasn't wild. It was warm. Because love, when it's real, doesn't need noise. It just needs truth. There's something powerful about a story that doesn't end where others expected it to. For Chloe Reed, life didn't begin the moment she became viral. It didn't start when a billionaire defended her in front of the world, or when headlines called her a hero. Her story began long before anyone was watching, when she knelt on cracked pavement to save a stranger, simply because it was the right thing to do. That's the first lesson. You don't need a stage to be brave. Courage often shows up when no one's filming. Integrity is quiet. It's not the applause that defines your worth, but the choices you make when no one is clapping. The second lesson is about dignity. Chloe didn't ask for revenge. She didn't retaliate. Even when humiliated in front of the city's elite, she stood tall. And that dignity, unshaken, graceful, unyielding, spoke louder than any insult ever could. And third, legacy is not inherited. It is chosen. Alexander was born into a name, but he chose truth. He chose to break cycles of silence. To love a woman not in spite of who she was, but because of it. Their story is more than romance. It's a reminder that when power meets compassion, something changes. That when history meets accountability, healing begins. And that when a Black woman stands in her truth, without apology, without compromise, the world has no choice but to listen. If you've ever felt dismissed, overlooked, or underestimated, remember this. Your voice is not small. Your story is not a footnote. You matter. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is stand still in the face of cruelty and refuse to bow. If this Black story resonated with you, share it. Leave a comment. Let us know where you're listening from. Because somewhere out there, someone else is standing in silence, waiting to hear that they're not alone. And stories like this, they don't just entertain. They empower.